All right, we're back. It's just like the opposite of Clubhouse. Video with no sound. That's what we're going for. The emerging video only market.
Okay, I think audio is definitely working this time. Can we get a confirmation in chat?
Yeah, someone let me know if you can hear us. I'll turn the music down. Just stop it straight up. Okay, nice. Excellent. All right. So we'll just run out into the intro once again. So hey, everybody, we're here to bring you an exciting special edition of Deprecations or API Deprecations at Shopify. Sorry, I'm Alex, and I have with me Nevin here. We're both on the developer advocacy team, and yeah, we're here to bring you a special edition of this because basically we're going to do a full review of all the breaking changes that were ever released to the platform. And the reason for that is because when COVID hit, we decided to postpone versioning for private apps, essentially, just because of the nature of like how tightly coupled they are with merchant solutions and how like the developers, like it might be a bit harder to get a hold of the developers. And so since it's been about a year since we've all had to adjust to the new normal, we want to bring private apps up to the same versioning cycle as every other app, so that all apps behave the same way. And so, yeah, this stream is going to be a review of all the breaking changes that ever happened, and then we'll finally culminate with our classic, what's going to happen with the 2020-07 version, which is the version that's about to become the oldest supported. Whew, that was a long sentence.
And I posted earlier in chat just a link to a little bit more information on private apps and the versioning behind it. I'll post it again just to make sure everyone sees it and you guys have a chance to take a look at it. But if you want some more information on versioning for private apps, have a look there.
Perfect. Yeah. So that link's awesome and kind of explains the reasoning and how we came to be here today. So because we want to cover everything, we'll skip our usual how versioning works at Shopify. If you're not familiar with that, I don't have a link handy, but it's covered in every blog post I do on the subject, and there'll be a new one coming out soon on the 2020-07 specific changes that we will cover here today already. So you kind of get a sneak peek of that that's coming up as well. So without further ado, I think that's all we wanted to cover before we jump right into it.
Yeah, I think so. Let's talk about the very first version.
Yeah, so good segue. So when we released versioning, the very first version we released was 2019-04. And so this is, I guess, what you could think of as the base version of the Shopify API. And again, it hasn't been publicly accessible or accessible to public apps, I guess I should say, for quite some time now, but a lot of private apps are still using it. And so in this version, there are essentially no changes. This is the base Shopify that we've used or known about for 2 years. And so that's where really we're going from here. I think, I guess like the only key like history lesson around this is that this was when we were also shipping some more multi-location stuff. And so as we go through the changes, it might appear like multi-location kind of comes out of nowhere, but that's kind of building on top of what was already released in 2019-04. So yeah, that's it for 2019-04. Moving on, the next one is 2019-07.
So 2019-07, I'll just mention quickly as well that you can always take a look at our release notes. So for example, I'll post 2019-07 in chat as well, so you can take a look at the release notes. In each one of our release notes, we include a section for breaking changes. So if you go back and take a look at these older versions, you'll see exactly what's changed between version to version in terms of breaking changes. And you'll be able to follow there in case your app calls or uses any of those features. You'll be able to hopefully adapt them and bring them up to speed so they don't break when 2021-04 comes out. So in 2019-07, there are 3 breaking changes. The first one is the GraphQL admin ID was added to webhooks. Now, this is kind of a weird one in that we added a field to the payload for the webhook payload for some of the resources. You would think that this is not a breaking change, but in a very specific case where if your app is using the Shopify app gem lower than 10.0.0 and a Rails version lower than 5.2.1.1, that's a mouthful, it will be a breaking change. So if your app falls in that very specific case, you'll have to deal with this.
Mm-hmm.
The second one is a field that's removed from the collect endpoint. And this is something that will show just through Insomnia here. Alex has a collection that we'll share towards the end of the stream that everyone will be able to take a look at if you want to see some specific examples of some of these breaking changes. But here, if we run this this call that's on 2019-04, I believe.
Mm-hmm.
You can see that in the URL there. We'll see that the featured field is there. It's currently set to false. So then if we...
We know if I need to, if in chat you could let me know if you can read this, I can like keep increasing the size until Insomnia decides to flip it completely. But yeah, so we'll be, right now we're calling, like Nevin said, 2019-04. We're hitting the collection endpoint. And what's important about this screen right now is we can see that the featured field still exists.
Yeah. So the return value there is in the preview at the bottom right part of Insomnia there. You'll see the featured field is set as false. If we flip over then to calling this same endpoint, but in 2019-07, as you can see there in the URL, you'll see that it is no longer there. So in the results, I can just scroll through all the different fields, but you'll see that featured has been removed. So if this was something that you were using or relying on, it's been removed and you'll have to adapt. The last change that's part of 2019-07 has to do with pagination. And this is kind of a big one. We've been trying to notify our private apps fairly proactively because obviously pagination is something that's used in many of our different endpoints. But page-based pagination has been removed. And instead of page-based pagination, we've moved to a cursor-based system instead. This improves speed. It obviously improves performance in terms of Shopify's infrastructure as well. And so if you're still using page-based pagination, it will no longer work. And you will have to adapt your versions both through REST and through GraphQL to use cursor-based pagination instead. And so here we have an example that Alice can pull up through Insomnia here that we're calling in 2019-07. And this is on the orders endpoint. And you can see here that we're just limiting it to 1. But the key point here is that in 2019-07, we can specify the page number. And when Alex ran this, he got a very normal result. We got a 1 order back, as you would expect. But if you ran this in 2019-10, using the same call, you'll see here that it actually errors out and it says that page cannot be passed in as a parameter. And it does point you at a URL for help to how to migrate your app and how to use cursor-based pagination. So again, this is a pretty big one. It touches a lot of endpoints. If you need any specific help, we encourage you to take a look at that URL that's returned to you there.
Yeah. And so one thing that's important to note about pagination too is the rollout of cursor-based pagination was actually done over two separate versions. So for some endpoints, the change happened in 2019-07, and then for others, it happened later on in 2019-10. Orders is actually a really good example here because it happened in the second one. So I can still, in 07, call orders with the page style pagination. But in 2019-10, I can no longer call it. And so it's not super relevant right now or anymore, I should say, because as we roll up private apps all the way to the current versioning schedule, private apps will hit all of the pagination or both pagination changes at the same time.
Exactly.
But that explains just why you might be able to access, version or page-based in certain versions for certain endpoints.
Yeah. And that wraps up 2019-07. So we'll move on to 2019-10 then.
Perfect. So let me scroll up in Insomnia here. And yeah, like Nevin said, the goal is to make this this whole Insomnia collection publicly available, so you can just kind of pull it in and plug in your credentials and be good to go, and kind of see, okay, this is what the behavior would look like firsthand. On that note, whenever that gets released, I want to caution people against like using their actual credentials, so your actual app's credentials with this Insomnia collection, because if you use your app credentials, Shopify is going to detect that your app is making these breaking changes that you're doing just like as a one-off, and so you'll get like all the flagging and the emails for all of the changes. So I'd encourage you to not use the production credentials you have, but any other private app credentials will work. Okay, so let's get straight into 2019-10. So like we mentioned, there was the second half of pagination that was added in 2019-10. So there's not any new queries here, but they do the same thing. The next one is this delivery profiles. So there was a field that was added, or sorry, I should say it was added and now it was removed. So this activated carrier service, if you query it in an older version, such as 07, you'll get a proper response. And then this is GraphQL only. If you attempt to query it in later versions, this one is actually, yep. So here we have 2021-01. It just doesn't exist. And so you'll get the error that it doesn't exist. End of story. Okay. The next set is all the multi-location style calls. So what's important is that for some of these, if the shop itself is not or is multi-location, then even in this version, those calls won't work. So that's why I have a note here in my Insomnia query. It's like, this will only work on non-multi-location inventory shops. So shops that are single location inventory is how I call them. All right, so anyone who's worked with variants before may remember that the most direct way before of adjusting inventory was just by passing in the actual inventory quantity you wanted on the variant. But these days, that concept has been separated into its own separate inventory level. And so if you attempt to adjust the inventory quantity on a variant directly, you'll get this error message. You'll get this, you can't use this. Please use the inventory levels API. So that's another big change. So if you're managing the inventory levels of your stock on variants, those apps are going to have to do it with the inventory APIs instead of the variant API. Okay. Fulfillment creation. Okay, so I think I may have already run this. So this may generate an error, but basically if you're creating a fulfillment on an order, passing in the regular bits of information, I'll run this once again. I think I've already run this. So, okay, so we'll get this error. But what's interesting enough is that if we go and run that same thing, but like in a later version, we should not get that error. We should get, okay, so we get the location specific error, or like the breaking API change that we'd expect. Okay, so what I'm doing here to back it up is I'm creating a fulfillment for an order. And what I'm doing is I'm not telling Shopify what location I want that order fulfilled from. And so again, this is all related to multi-location. So before that made sense because there was only ever one location. But now with multi-location, you actually need to pass in a location ID as an additional field here, or an additional parameter, I should say. Cool. I'll take a quick break to see if anybody's in chat. We're good. No questions so far. Let's keep going. Okay. The next one is creating refunds. So refunds have a similar concept where before you could create a refund and you could say, okay, I restock the item, like it's available for purchase once again. And again, in a single location world, you didn't have to specify a location. But in multi-location, you have to tell Shopify at which location you want to restock that item. Okay. So I don't know if I've run this one already, so we'll try running this. Okay. So if I try to run this directly, it'll tell, this is like a standard error message that you would get if you tried to refund an order without that was already refunded, which is fine. And now if we go to the later version, we'll see that like, okay, we actually get a separate error message. So this is like the additional breaking change that's coming in. So this is the one telling us like, hey, this has already been refunded. And then there's the other error message coming in that says, hey, you need to tell us, like, if this was going to work, then you have to tell us where to restock this item. I think that's it for 2019-10. I think we're good to go.
And hopefully that multi-location thing is pretty sensible. If you're running multiple locations, I think it makes sense to pass in the location ID, and this breaking change hopefully is just follows along the sort of a very sensible workflow in terms of making sure that you're, adjusting the quantities in the right places, refunding in the right places, all those kinds of things.
Yeah, for sure. Like, think about it in terms of, I guess, the real world outside of the API, where a customer might buy something from one location, but then they were only visiting. Not, I guess not. The scenario doesn't make sense in a COVID world, but they go to a different location and they return the actual item to a different location. And so it would make sense that you need to track that, right? Shopify can't just assume that the customer is returning it to the same shop.
Totally makes sense. All right. So we'll go to 2020-01. Just 2 breaking changes as part of this version. And the first one has to do with the Collects API. So right now, previously the Collects API returns collects associated with custom collections. But this makes it so that it no longer returns products associated with smart collections. So we have a couple of queries here that we'll run through in Insomnia. Alex, you want to go through those?
Yeah, for sure. So the first query that we have is going to be an old version of the API, and it's going to kind of just showcase that all the collects are returned. So if you hit the collects index endpoint, you get all of the collects. And side note for anybody who is not familiar with the collects API, it's like a collect is simply like the relationship block or piece, I guess, between a variant and a collection. So it kind of denotes ownership. It's more of a backend concept that shouldn't really need to be exposed. And so, anyways, that's just the history behind it. So going back, so in old versions of the API, you can see all the collects, including those from smart collections, in the index. And now if we go to the next version, we'll see that, okay, I've actually lost a collect, and that's not because it's gone anywhere. It's just we've stopped returning the ones that are associated to smart collections.
Yeah, and so if you're wondering then how to access that one that you previously were getting, there's actually a new endpoint available, which we can demonstrate here. This is when you look at a specific collect. Again, so now if you try to access that smart collection collect, it's not going to show up, even if you try to access it directly like this. And so then moving on to what Nevin was talking about, we actually have a new endpoint where you can get all this information. So if you try to hit this endpoint in old versions, again, this Insomnia Collection is very much like, okay, here's the behavior before, here's the behavior after. So before, this endpoint just doesn't exist, so you'll get a classic 404. But then if you want to see an actual collection, then you hit the collections endpoint. And so, as I mentioned before, the goal of this was really to kind of remove that middle block from like the concerns of the API. Like, apps don't need to see that information. Like, we should present that information in a way more usable way. So like, instead of scanning all the collects and doing the mapping yourself, it's like, okay, here's the collection API. And on the collection API, so this endpoint, actually, I'll scroll over here. You'll see it's just literally, API version / collections. And then you can pick a specific collection to get the info. And then in that specific collection, you could make another call, which is like the collection / products. And then it'll actually just show you the products that are associated to that. So this is the products that are associated to my collection. So no more having to worry about manually scraping through all the collects to make sense of things. Makes sense. Hopefully that makes sense in the chat as well. Let us know if you have any questions or if anything here doesn't make sense. Great. And then the only other change then as part of 2020-01 was that we limited the maximum input array size for GraphQL operations to 250. So this is pretty obvious, I think, but just to show you how it worked previously, we have a query here that we're passing in an import array of 251 items. So if we send that, we get a result. And then if we try that exact same query, even though we're getting null data, if we try that exact same query in a newer version, again, 251 items, we actually get an error back that says the input size is greater than 250. So this is pretty straightforward. It's just purely a limitation on the input array size.
Yeah, so in GraphQL, we've always had like a 250 limit on connections. And so there was kind of this hole in the API, like performance-wise, where apps could ask for an infinite amount of things as long as it was like, oh, I'm just asking for an array. And so that's kind of what this one is like the classic one is when you ask for just like the node, I guess I'll call it endpoint or API in GraphQL, or the node object or the node's connection. And in that you can specify, it doesn't matter what the type is, you can just specify as long as you have the IDs, like nodes of any type. And so for our example here, we have like 1 to 251, and like those products don't exist on my shop, which is why each of them is returning null. But it still highlights the concept of like, okay, I could have asked for like 10,000 objects here, real objects, and gotten them back. And that might have taken a while and it wouldn't have been performant. And so we just applied like the same safety limits to arrays as we did to more standard connections.
Cool. That's it for 2020-01. We have 2 more versions to cover, so let's move on to 2020-04.
Okay, we're getting there. In 2020-04, relatively small changes. We had added a mutation for bulk add price reduction. So you could bulk add price reductions. That's where the space should be, or the pause in the sentence. And so before, basically, we added this for a version and then decided it wasn't quite ready to be consumed and used. So we wanted to take it back and do some more work on it. And so that's why it's still technically accessible via 2020-04. If I run this here, my private app actually doesn't have access. So we'll get an access denied message here, which is fine, because like what we're trying to showcase here is that when we go to the 04 version, it just simply doesn't exist. So it's kind of like that delivery profiles change where there's just something that's been pulled out of the API. And so, of course, if you're using this, like all the standard tooling exists and you should be getting notifications about this. But because it was only live for one version, there's not, like, the usage was not too high. So we were able to pull it back. The only other aspect too that's in 2020-04 that we don't have a query here for, because it's kind of a like, I don't want to say strangely breaking. It's not. Yeah, it's like a notification. It's like we want people to know, but it's not actually. So essentially, for certain types, there are new error codes. So if your app is handling like a set of error codes, and usually in our GraphQL API, those are enumerations or just enums. And so if you're expecting, a set of 5 different errors that could happen, now this is a 6th one. And so if your app isn't set up to handle any like other, or, if your error handling is something like if statement, condition, or enum 1, enum 2, enum 3, enum 4, and you don't have one that's like else anything else. Yeah, if you don't have an else there, then your app might miss the new error codes that were not handle it in a way. Basically, it'll miss that whole conditional. And so, adding an error code is just kind of enhancing the level of detail that we're providing. And so it's not breaking in that sense, but we're erring on the side of caution and just letting apps know via like all the notification systems that this happened.
Cool. All right, we're in the final stretch here. We're looking at 2020-07. And we have 3 different breaking changes. We'll start off first actually with maybe checkout, because this is exactly like the one we just talked about, We also added an error code here. Same kind of thing. This theoretically really shouldn't be breaking, but in the case where you're handling error codes very explicitly and not handling the quote unquote unknown case, then this could break your app. But otherwise, this is just adding another enum, another error code to that response. Next one here is the product variant had images removed from it. And so this is just in the return field here. You can see when we run this in 2020-04, I believe, it does return it. And then if we run it in 2020-07, images, you'll see here, doesn't exist in product variant. So again, this is just something that's been removed. Should be very straightforward to handle if you're migrating your app.
Mm-hmm. If you're using this, I mean, there's a bit of history, I think, in the release notes on this, but essentially it was one of those where we had a field called images, and then we realized like, oh, there's no, like, there will not be more than one image, and so it was renamed to be image, which is what even like Insomnia here is providing us. It says like, cannot query field images. Did you mean image? So it's just a very short hop over, and it'll turn it like from an array into just the actual source
single
string.
value. Yeah.
Yeah.
Cool. And the last breaking change here is the allocation method for discounts.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So this change, if you want to.
No, go ahead.
Yeah, I'll handle it. Yeah, so this change essentially is another like enum change. So it's one of those like, okay, is it breaking? Is it not? So it's pretty informative. And so the short version of it is that for discounts that have a target selection, and like this is going to get real specific if you don't know discounts, but if they have a target selection of explicit, we realize that we had like one, each, and across as values, and that like one, like in certain cases, basically we can make do with just each and across. And so we should simplify the API in that way. So when you call, when you're querying things, so for example, like I'm getting an order here with a discount, and when I submit this, it'll kind of show that the allocation method for this target selection is 1. And then when I go to later versions, it becomes across. So here's like that same discount, except it's set to across now.
And so the reason why we did this was that functionally 1 and across are the same thing. And so to simplify things, anytime you had previously been returned a value of 1, you should now expect the return value to be across instead. And so again, we're erring on the side of safety here, and we're just calling this out. So if you have this, if you use this as part of your app, make sure that you handle this case well. Mm-hmm. We have a question here in chat that we want to make sure that we get to. Do you have any tips on how to prepare an app for changes in the API? So I guess we could talk about versioning a little bit here, because I think it should cover that whole concept.
Yeah, for sure.
Versioning. So the way we roll out versions here at Shopify is that we roll a new version out once per quarter. And so a new version will be coming out in April. So first week of April 1st, or maybe 3rd, I think, depending on the dates of when the weekends are. When that version comes out, any breaking change that we have set there will be supported for 1 year after we announce that breaking change. And so that means that after a year has elapsed, we will stop supporting that version. And so your apps will be forced to migrate. And that's why we're going through all these older versions now, because all these older versions have already, quote unquote, expired. They have already elapsed in terms of our support window. And so we're making sure that as we bring private apps up to speed with public apps, we're just making sure that everyone knows about all the breaking changes that had happened in the past.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so within that versioning framework, I guess, like my tip would be that if you can read the release notes every quarter, then you'll be set. Like you'll be on the ball, and like when you read a release note, you know, like, okay, I have at most 1 year and then at least 9 months to deal with the changes that were announced here. Yeah, I don't know if you were looking for something more specific, but like, yeah, the goal really is within this framework is that it gives you that expected cadence. So if you check your app or like even just the release notes like once a quarter, you'll have the summary of everything you need. In terms of like coding your app specifically, I guess like the one thing I would say is like build your app in a way that you are requesting a specific version instead of just kind of always asking for the latest. Because then that gives you, I'd say, like more stability, because you decide when the version hops over if as long as you're proactive about it. Whereas if you have like because a lot of these private apps have the were built pre-versioning, and so they have the pattern of not including a version number, so they get served the oldest supported version, and then yeah, it's just gonna like I don't want to say suddenly, because it's like within our like the cadence we talk about all the time, but it moves like as not a direct thing under, I guess, like the app developer's control, which is the aspect that that'd be like my one tip is like avoid that by just being proactive with both the migrations and like how you're specifying which version you want to get back. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it certainly makes sense to me. And I think the one thing too that I'll point out is, with every release that we put out, with these release notes, we're very explicit about the breaking changes so that it's not obscured or anything. We're very open about it. And I think generally speaking, we try not to break the API. Like even going through all the breaking changes that we have today, I think there are maybe a dozen, and a couple of them we're adding error code. So if you think about it, just keep on top of it. Again, it's once a quarter. There really should be a very small handful of breaking changes anyway, and so if you keep an eye on that, you should be good to go.
Mm-hmm. And I guess the other like last tip that's more of a like a partner or app business tip, I guess, is like, because like we have this cadence, then like it's really like I feel like it should be like fairly seamless to like even do support contracts on your end for this kind of stuff. So if you're a private app developer and you're working for a merchant, then like you can build you can build your expectation or the merchant's expectation of like any maintenance work you do on the app on top of like versioning, and be like, okay, I'm going to check the app, I'm going to check the API health report of the app like once a quarter, and that will keep you on top of the game.
Yeah, makes sense. Any other questions in the chat? I haven't seen any so far, but feel free to throw them at us. We'll be happy to answer them.
Yeah, this is now open Q&A AMA.
And it's worth mentioning again, we've been showing you a lot of these calls through Insomnia here. We will be making this Insomnia Collection public, so that if you want any very specific info on how these changes are breaking and what you can expect to return in older versions versus newer ones, we're going to make this publicly available so everyone can download it and take it out for themselves. There's also going to be an upcoming forum post that's going to highlight a lot of these changes as well, or all of these changes, I should say.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so if you're looking for the Insomnia Collection, it'll be released as part of like the blog that's going to be coming out that's covering the 2020-07 changes. And yeah, like Nevin mentioned, I'll also throw it into the blog or the forum post where we can all chat about the. We have like a very long name for this. It's like private app versioning extension end.
End of life, yeah.
Yeah, and yeah, so it's a mouthful.
Cool. Well, I'm not seeing anything else in the chat, so I think hopefully everyone that's watching, you've got something out of this. Anything else from your end, Alex?
No, I think that's it. I mean, we're always open for questions, and if we didn't get to you, or if you're watching this later, you can reach out to me directly on like the partner Slack or on Twitter. I'm at Lopert there. Nevin, I don't know if you have a public reach outable persona.
Yeah, you can reach out to me on Twitter at N10 83. I'm also on the partners Slack as well. I'll link mine in the chat. Obviously, you can reach out to our Shopify devs Twitter handle as well. Lots of people monitoring that, and we'll be able to reach or get back to you through that channel as well.
Awesome. I think that's a good place to cut it. No questions in the last 2-3 minutes, so we'll end it there.
Awesome.
All right. Thanks everyone for tuning in. Yeah.
Have a good day.